I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics, Messianicapologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for March the 17th, 2026. Today on our Theology Roundup, we will be reviewing the Book of Leviticus. And the reason for this is that in the annual Torah cycle, we've just concluded the Book of Exodus. If you'll remember, all the way back to the end of December, and then all the way back to the beginning of the Torah cycle, we went through Genesis, Exodus. This week, of course, is the Torah reading Vayikra, and he called, which begins the book of Leviticus. And so we're going to go through these composition studies the week or close to the week we begin a new book in the Torah cycle. So, okay. Okay, I had to fix something. So, our study is taken from our ministry publication at MessianicTheology.store, a survey of the Holy Scriptures for the practical Messianic. This is an important resource. It sort of serves as to my knowledge, the only survey of the Holy Scriptures, Old Testament or New Testament introduction book in the Messianic movement. So this is something you'll definitely want to add to your resource library. Available in both paperback as well as ebook for Amazon Kindle. MessianicTheology.store. All right, so let me switch windows really quickly, and then we will get into our study discussing the composition of Leviticus. All right, there we go. Now, one of the things I probably need to emphasize before we get into this is how many of us, when we read the books of the Torah, we often just automatically assume that for centuries, everyone has believed that Moses not only oversaw the composition of Leviticus, but that he himself wrote down every single letter, jot, and tittle, and that it's been preserved perfectly since Mount Sinai. That is something which, it's an idea which circulates throughout a great deal of today's Messianic community. However, very, very quickly, when you get into biblical studies, when you get into matters of the composition of the Holy Scriptures, you find out that not everyone has believed that. And in the critical tradition, which is something witnessed in liberal Christianity as well as liberal Judaism, it is widely believed that the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, was the product of different source materials redacted together after the Babylonian exile, the JEDP documentary hypothesis. Excuse me. And JEDP represents different sources for the Pentateuch. J, wherever the divine name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh appeared in the text. Why J and not Y? Because in German, the divine name is spelled with the letter J, or the Yod. E, wherever the term Elohim was used, that represented a source, and J probably came from the southern kingdom, E probably came from the northern kingdom. D, the Deuteronomist, the so-called pious fraud, which initiated the Josianic reforms. Conservatives definitely agree that right before the Josianic reforms, that it was a scroll of Deuteronomy discovered in the temple complex. But was it discovered because it was lost, or was it written then in order to initiate the Josianic reforms? And then the P source, or the priestly materials, which are believed to have widely composed information pertaining to the tabernacle, sacrificial system, the worship rituals and procedures of a lot of ancient Israelite life. So the book of Leviticus, as well as a substantial amount of Numbers, widely considered in the critical tradition to originate from the priestly writer, the priestly source. So we're going to get into some of that today. In all probability, in your Messianic congregation or synagogue, you don't hear that much about the documentary hypothesis. I don't believe it. But as soon as you get a certain study Bible, a commentary, and you encounter references to, in the case here, P, what do you do about it? So we're not going to hold back in terms of recognizing that there are liberal theories out there and how we as conservatives should engage with them. All right, a survey of the book of Leviticus, composition of Leviticus in the workbook, a survey of the Holy Scriptures. Doing a survey of the Bible is one of the most important studies you can ever do as a person. So if you get the survey of the Holy Scriptures workbook, your personal survey of Leviticus, I recommend that you have a notebook, some kind of a journal, read through the book of Leviticus, keeping a journal log of people, places, key themes and events, and major scripture passages. And you are actually encouraged to do that in a single sitting. You won't know how much information you actually are able to just acquire as a Bible reader until you sit down. Have you ever read Leviticus in a single sitting before? You know, it might take you 2 or 3 hours, and have a journal or a notebook. Oh, that person, that place. Here's some questions I have. Here's some observations I have. Doing that with not just Leviticus, but all the books of the Bible, one of the most important studies you will ever do as a Messiah follower. All right, so here's a little bit of the theological summary of Leviticus. The time period, formation of Israel as the nation called out by God. The author, Moses exclusively, those on the right, Moses, Joshua, and later editors, conservative, moderate, and compiled traditions and mythologies, those on the left. So that's where you would see the adherents of the documentary hypothesis. The location of the author, the wilderness journey after the Exodus, right, conservative, moderate, Babylon and or the land of Israel, those on the left. And the target audience and their location, the people of Israel wandering in the desert, those on the right, conservative moderates, Jewish exiles returning from Babylon, those on the left. So obviously for myself, I would be in the conservative moderate category. I would adhere to Mosaic oversight of the book of Leviticus. That does not mean that Moses had to actually write any of it. He could have commissioned scribes to do it for him. But what it means more than anything else is that the book of Leviticus is a product of Moses. Didn't come centuries later after the Babylonian exile. That doesn't mean that there might not be some places where there was some post-Mosaic editing, redaction, but it means that in doing a study on Leviticus, we can talk about Moses communicates and then make a quotation from Leviticus. All right. Let's get into the summary of Leviticus here. The third book of the Torah bears the Hebrew name Vayikra, right? That's this week's Torah reading, meaning, and he called, derived from its first verse. Then the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. Leviticus 1:1, New American Standard. The English term Leviticus is derived from its Greek Septuagint title, Luitikon, which means pertaining to the Levites. This carried over into the Latin Vulgate as Liber Leviticus. Some Jewish traditions, notably in the Mishnah, refer to this text as Torat Kohanim, the instruction of the priests, or various derivatives. The service of the priests in the life of Israel is undeniably a major feature of this book. The book of Leviticus functions as part of a long narrative beginning in Exodus 25 with the giving of the tabernacle instructions. Leviticus continues these instructions with the only discontinuity occurring when laws regulating Israel proper are given. As Leviticus begins, readers see how the tabernacle had been manufactured, and now Israel needed to know how to function with it present, becoming a special nation unto God. The instruction contained in Leviticus makes up almost a third of the Torah and spans about a year of the Israelite sojourn. Many examiners think that the giving of many of the commandments in Leviticus is interwoven with the proclamation of the Decalogue on Mount Sinai, Exodus chapters 19 and 20, and probably also the covenant ceremony, Exodus chapters 21 through 24. The textual themes of Leviticus often concern the special duties of the Levites, as well as the service of worship at the tabernacle, later to be applied to the Jerusalem temple. It is absolutely accurate to conclude, quote, Leviticus consists almost entirely of law and ritual, unquote, from Levine, Anchor Bible Dictionary. However, even though the important role of the priests is detailed in Leviticus, this book is not solely concerned with priests. Leviticus ultimately concerns all of the people of Israel. In the Jewish theological tradition, Leviticus sits at the center and heart of the Torah. It is often used early to introduce Jewish children to the commandments of the Torah so they can learn to be viable members of the religious community. Leviticus is fairly straightforward, and it is not difficult to inculcate its principles into one's psyche. As Oswald T. Alice notes, quote, Leviticus is in no sense an esoteric book. The people were entitled and expected to know exactly what was required of them and of their priests in that service of the sanctuary which so deeply concerned every Israelite. Unquote. New Bible Commentary Revised. Christian handling of Leviticus is often vastly different than compared to that of Judaism. Christian exegetes often have a very difficult time understanding the holiness code contained in Leviticus. Among theologians and teachers who examine Leviticus, there is often a great deal of allegorizing of the text. Many only prefer to look at the messianic symbolism of Leviticus, solely interpreting it in light of the Christ event. There is significant difficulty in reading Leviticus because it contains a great deal of commandments which many believe are no longer valid or relevant. But Jewish New Testament studies are revealing more and more that Yeshua and the apostles not only observed these things in the first century, but upheld their validity as a standard to be continued. Commandments of considerable difficulty for Christians to understand are those of clean, unclean, and pure, impure. They are often regarded as being archaic, not as simple elements of the obedience which God required of his people. In defense of Christian exegesis and commentary on Leviticus, though, many have made comparisons between the service of the priests and the service of ministers and pastors in local churches today. The book of Leviticus deals with several kinds of regulations: worship, ceremonial cleanness, various moral laws, God's appointed times, the sabbatical year, and the year of Jubilee. Most of these commandments were delivered by God to Moses during the year when ancient Israel encamped at Mount Sinai. How many were actually given while Moses was on the mountain versus when he was in the tent of meeting cannot be fully known. The key theme of the book of Leviticus is undeniably the holiness of God and how he wanted his people to be separated out. As decreed, I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy. Leviticus 11:45, New American Standard. A theme repeated throughout not only the Tanakh, but also the apostolic scriptures. Leviticus may be divided into 5 principal sections: the sacrificial system, Leviticus chapters 1 through 7, the inaugural service of the sanctuary, Leviticus chapters 8 through 10, the laws of impurities, Leviticus chapters 11 through 16, the holiness code, Leviticus chapters 17 through 26, and the commutation of gifts of the sanctuary, Leviticus chapter 27. These subdivisions witnessed how God wanted his people to be transferred into the realm of being clean and sacred. Leviticus required perfect animals to be sacrificed, Leviticus chapters 1 through 7, and that only priests without physical deformity could serve, Leviticus chapters 8 through 10. Signs of physical blemish are listed, including a woman's discharge after birth, Leviticus chapter 12, sores, burns, or certain types of baldness, Leviticus chapters 13 and 14, a man's seminal discharge, Leviticus 15, 1 through 18. Jewish and Christian commentators today are not fully agreed as to whether such signs signify ritual impurity and or spiritual impurity. However, before one could re-enter the camp of ancient Israel, certain types of sacrifices needed to be offered. With Leviticus, readers see how God began to establish his theocracy through the people of Israel. Notable sacrifices among those categorized would include those for the Day of Atonement, Leviticus chapter 16, a day of national mourning and repentance. Between the commandments given in Leviticus sit 2 major narratives: the death of Nadab and Abihu, Leviticus 10, 12 through 19, and God imparting Israel the eye for eye principle, Leviticus 24, 17 through 22. Interestingly, when considering these and other points in Leviticus, some liberal commentators have considered the commandments in Leviticus to demonstrate some key salvation principles. Quote, Hebrew law is Heil's Gesetz, sacred and saving law. Heil's Gesetz in the Old Testament not only records and is the revelation of a divine order of society, but also seeks to establish such a society in the Commonwealth of Israel. The character and function of Leviticus then is summed up in this idea of Heil's Gesetz, unquote. Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible. And yes, we are reminded here that there are a lot of important theological terms from German. Apparently, a critical part of God's salvation demonstrated toward human beings is understanding his sacredness. Any reading of Leviticus cannot fail to consider this. Now, this is where we're going to get into what I briefly mentioned before we got started: the authorship issue of Leviticus. And again, for a lot of people in the Messianic community, all the 30 years I've been involved in it, well, Moses is the author of Leviticus. And yes, I am small c conservative. I would affirm Leviticus as a product of Mosaic composition. But in the critical tradition, which affects liberal Christians and liberal Jews, Leviticus is, along with the Pentateuch, the product of the post-Babylonian exile. And among the 4 main sources, it's believed to have come from the priestly source, which, from their perspective, that's not a surprise because the bulk of Leviticus, and this also will spill into Numbers a little bit, the bulk of Leviticus pertain to the sacrificial system, the worship system of Israel. The authorship of Leviticus, as with all books of the Pentateuch, is a debated issue among conservative and liberal examiners. Ancient tradition, both Jewish and Christian, ascribed authorship of Leviticus to Moses. It is notable that almost every chapter of the text includes the phrase, "The Lord spoke to Moses," pointing to some kind of Mosaic involvement. Conservative examiners today will generally accept principal Mosaic involvement in the composition of Leviticus, especially as these are the commandments which the Lord commanded Moses for the sons of Israel at Mount Sinai. Leviticus 27:34, New American Standard. Specific commandments are given by God to Moses in Leviticus, i.e., Leviticus 1:1, 4:1, 6:1, a fact confirmed in the apostolic scriptures, Romans 10:5. Most conservatives will, however, concede that Moses probably did not compose Leviticus in its final form and will allow for some pre- and or post-exilic redaction of the text. R.K. Harrison notes how, excuse me, quote, Egyptian material was revised from time to time by various generations of scribes, unquote. And it is possible that the ancient Israelites may have employed similar techniques. What is perhaps more significant to consider, as Gordon J. Wenham indicates, is that, quote, Leviticus claims throughout to record what God revealed to Moses. Nowhere does it ever state that Moses wrote down what he heard, unquote. International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. Many Messianics would argue for exclusive Mosaic authorship of Leviticus, including his penning all of it with his own hand. They would have difficulty with the view that Moses may have given the information God relayed to him to scribes or someone in his inner circle to then write down. But even if Moses did not actually write down Leviticus with his own hand, he was still ultimately its human author. In favor of its antiquity, conservatives point out that the strong theological assertion present in Leviticus is that it was to prepare Israel for living in the promised land. Arguments which are commonly made in favor of Leviticus being originally written around the time of the Exodus often stem from comparison with other literature in the ancient Near East. The law code present in Leviticus was not unique to the second millennium BCE, and the establishment of the covenant between Israel and its God was consistent with other agreements made in the second millennium BCE as well. R. Laird Harris asserts, quote, God used Moses' extensive legal background and knowledge of the common law of the East, and thus some of the laws are of the familiar case type law, unquote, from the Expositor's Bible Commentary. What makes Leviticus unique when compared to the other law codes of the ancient Near East was how Israel's God was so concerned for his people rather than being God's rather than Israel being God's slaves. The priestly nature of the text confirms this, incorporating the reality that they would be responsible for training the people, which itself is, quote, a tradition that was established by the Sumerians, and the same can be said for ancient Egypt, unquote. Harrison. Liberal examiners, in stark contrast to the conservative view of dating Leviticus back to the second millennium BCE, commonly ascribe authorship to P, or the so-called priestly writer, often ignoring much conservative opinion. Some apply P authorship to just Leviticus chapters 1 through 16 and the holiness code of Leviticus chapters 17 through 26 to a theoretical H. Liberals assume a very late date for Leviticus composition, usually 500 to 450 BCE, after the return of the Jewish exiles from Babylon, and often describe the material as Josianic, with much having originated during the reign of King Josiah. That's different than the so-called pious fraud of Deuteronomy, but we'll get into that later on, of course, when we get to Deuteronomy in the Torah cycle this year. They will often argue that the P material is difficult to reconcile with other material in the Torah, and in response, critics of the JEDP documentary hypothesis will sometimes claim that the so-called P source came from a, quote, Hegelian evolutionary philosophy, unquote. Harrison, New International Dictionary of the Bible, of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Some of you all are familiar with that. Liberal examiners will often claim that the complexities of Leviticus cannot be present in a document which dates from between 1500 to 1300 BCE. But this is challenged by many conservatives who argue that there were more complicated religious systems in place before this time. Quote, elaborate rituals and sacrificial systems are attested in the ancient Near East long before the time of Moses. The normal critical view that these institutions are a late feature of Israelite religion is contrary to what is known about the religious practices in neighboring contemporary culture, unquote. Wenham International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. Further critiques of the liberal hypothesis of dating Leviticus rather late is that no situation would have presented itself in Babylon requiring the separation of clean and unclean animals, requiring this code to have previously existed, and also the fact that leprosy was widely known as a disease as far back as the 3rd millennium BCE, likewise requiring some kind of pre-exilic regulation. In recent days, the common liberal view of Leviticus has been changing in certain schools. The unity of the text in relationship to the entire Torah is being acknowledged. Quote, rhetorically, the material is presented as the direct word of God and thus makes a claim to absolute and unchallengeable authority, unquote. Thomas B. Dozeman, New Interpreter Study Bible. While P is sometimes described as, quote, least difficult, unquote, Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, excuse me, of the Pentateuchal sources which liberals identify, liberal Jewish scholars are challenging its rather date-lating and are beginning to argue for a much earlier dating of P, leading just a few to consider some kind of Mosaic involvement, or at least considering a significant part of it pre-exilic. Furthermore, literary examinations of the Torah are causing many to seriously question the JEDP documentary hypothesis, and Leviticus is no exception. Ironically, classical liberals often admit, quote, Jesus canonized Leviticus once for all, unquote. Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, especially with the Messiah's emphasis on God's love. Few divergences exist among extant editions of the Hebrew Masoretic text of Leviticus. Fragments of Leviticus in Paleo-Hebrew or Phoenician script were discovered at Qumran, even though they are often dated from the 2nd to 1st centuries BCE. Both the Samaritan Pentateuch and Greek Septuagint editions of Leviticus reflect various interpretive traditions in their renderings, allowing some theologians to conclude that the Hebrew source text behind these versions was older than today's extant Masoretic text. It is notable that the Septuagint includes some distinct Pharisaical interpretations of commandments. The apostles' usage of the Septuagint in their writings should make some of these halakhic judgments authoritative for Messianics today, which often parallel the customs of mainline Judaism today and not some of the small sectarian movements of the 1st century. In evangelical Protestant theology, teachings on Leviticus often include the critical need to know about the New Testament emphases on loving one's neighbor, Leviticus 19:18. Also, Mark 12:31, Matthew 5:43, 19:19, 22:39, Luke 10:27, Romans 13:9, Galatians 5:24, James 2:8. In an historical sense, evangelicals will often emphasize how one needs to understand the laws and customs found in Leviticus, which Yeshua observed as a Jew living on earth. Coupled with this is the fact that believers need to understand the Levitical priesthood and its relationship to Yeshua's priesthood described in Hebrews. The tabernacle system is, to a degree, internalized in believers' hearts, 2 Corinthians 6:16. Evangelicals are right to emphasize the fact that when compared to ancient religions, a strong thrust of Leviticus' message is on seeing one's relationship to God restored. The concern of God for the well-being of his people is thoroughly demonstrated in the detail of Leviticus. A great deal of Leviticus cannot be kept today without an operating tabernacle or temple, and those who often argue in favor of the continuance of all of the Torah usually fail to recognize that the work of Yeshua has set aside the Levitical sacrificial system, Hebrews 7:18, until the millennium, Ezekiel chapters 40 to 44. This position, however, is not adhered to by most, who will instead often highlight only the parts of Leviticus which can be observed in the modern world, such as the kosher dietary laws or the appointed times. It should be noted, however, that while there is a broad Messianic consensus that the seventh-day Sabbath, appointed times, and dietary regulations have continued relevance and validity, there are diverse opinions and views about how these things should be followed. Some sectors of the Messianic movement lack a consideration for the style of halakha as demonstrated by Yeshua and the apostles in first century Judaism, instead preferring to reconstruct how they believe various commandments should be followed from the text without considering any other biblical tradition. However, more and more Messianics who study Leviticus every year are making profound connections to how its commandments are applied in the apostolic scriptures. The holiness of God, which he requires of his people, is something which must be emphasized in today's generation, and it is seen all throughout Leviticus. Many will simply label the last third of Leviticus, 17:1 to 25:55, as the holiness code, with God emphasizing the blessings and consequences of obedience and disobedience. But holiness is certainly much more than just do's and don'ts. God desires his people to be holy just like he is, and be separated out from the ways of the world. Many holiness movements in the past several centuries have used verses from Leviticus which focus on ethics and morality, such as the German piety movement and Wesleyan movement of the 17th and 18th centuries, respectively. With this in mind, excuse me, the Messianic community today needs to understand that it has been endowed with a sacred trust from the Lord to convey a greater fullness of his holiness, demonstrated by not only commandments dealing with morality, but also how we conduct ourselves outwardly as his people. We are often quick to judge our evangelical brothers and sisters for their dismissal of many of Leviticus's outward commandments, in spite of the fact that many sincere Christians remain true to God's ethical commandments. As Wenham summarizes, quote, "It seems fair to say that the New Testament only accepts the moral law of the Old Testament, but reiterates its basic theology," unquote. International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. Harris further remarks, quote, "We can learn principles of atonement, prayer, faith, and grace from Israel's ceremonies of justice in business, honor in home, truth in speech, and so forth from Israel's civil legislation," unquote. Expositor's Bible Commentary. Building on foundations such as these, with Yeshua as the focus, should make it easier to emphasize other points seen in Leviticus, involving the importance of matters such as Sabbath, kosher, and ritual purity. There are some notable weaknesses in the Messianic community concerning Leviticus, specifically with the lack of engagement with current conservative scholarship concerning its antiquity. Too much attention has probably been given to ultra-Orthodox and/or Hasidic Jewish commentaries on Leviticus at the expense of examining its historical setting. Another valid critique that could be given is that some might base their interpretations of Torah commandments solely on what is seen in Leviticus, and they are not reconciled with their counterparts in Deuteronomy, which may add further details, to say nothing how they are applied elsewhere in the Bible. Furthermore, a lack of understanding of some of Leviticus's regulations in light of the ancient Near East can lead to some misinterpretations with how they are applied in the apostolic scriptures. All right, now before I forget to mention this, I just said that there are instructions given in Leviticus regarding various aspects of the Torah. Some people in the Messianic community, they only look at Leviticus, yet there are further instructions given elsewhere in the Torah, particularly in Deuteronomy. Very soon, in the next few weeks, we will be remembering Passover and unleavened bread. And while Leviticus 23 is a great place to start for people who want to get introduced to the appointed times, the Moedim, Leviticus 23 is not the only place, of course, in the Holy Scriptures which detail the appointed times. And one of the big controversies which can come up in remembrance of the appointed times as Messianic people, and this happens every year, is the counting of the Omer, right? The 7 weeks between Passover, unleavened bread, and the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, also more commonly known as Pentecost. And one of the factors which plays into, well, do you adhere to the traditional Pharisaic method of counting the Omer or the Sadduceical counting of the Omer, can involve, are you only looking at Leviticus 23, or are you considering other pieces of information elsewhere in the Torah itself? So I'm probably going to have to go through counting the Omer when we get closer to the week of Passover. And look, you can go on our website right now, messianicapologetics.net, look at the frequently asked question entry. We're probably the only Messianic ministry which will present you with both of the main methods of counting the Omer, the Pharisaical method, which begins its count after the high Sabbath of Passover, the Sadduceical method, which would begin the count after the weekly Sabbath associated with Passover. And indeed, what it ultimately comes down to is how much or how little information are you considering? But that can be one of the weak points that some Messianics have with Leviticus. Leviticus is important, no question about it. But what about additional instruction given regarding a particular issue elsewhere in the Torah, much less elsewhere in the Tanakh and even the apostolic writings? All right, let's conclude. Of all the issues which we need to consider when reading Leviticus is the need for us to truly understand that this text is sacred and saving law, the German Heilsgesetz. We need to understand how to focus on the missional aspects of Leviticus and how the Lord is concerned with the well-being of his people. We need to emphasize how God wants to have communion with his people and be restored to them, themes ultimately embodied in his son, Yeshua the Messiah. All right, and let me switch windows back really quickly before we get into our news summary. All right, and this study has been taken from our ministry workbook, A Survey of the Holy Scriptures for the Practical Messianic. And as I said, when we started this new Torah cycle on Messianic Insider, when we go into a new book of the Torah that week, although for Exodus we did it a little sooner because we were going out of town to the IMCS Rabbis Conference, we'll go through the composition. So in the next few months, it'll be our plan to go through the book of Numbers. But you don't have to wait to go through the book of Numbers. You can get a survey of the Holy Scriptures now. And as it implies, it goes through the composition of every book of the Bible from a Messianic perspective. All right, let's move over to our news roundup now. Now, we do the news roundup after the theology roundup because the news is, of course, time sensitive and it changes from day to day. And right now, as we look at the Middle East with Operation Epic Fury or Operation Roaring Lion. Epic Fury is the U.S. operation. Roaring Lion is the Israeli operation. The news is literally changing hour to hour. So we don't have as many news stories today as we did yesterday from the weekend, but there are some things we're going to be noting. And I'm just kind of giving you some high points of what I encounter on social media passively, mainly on Instagram as well as X. I don't go out and hunt for stories, but I do check these different venues several times a day, several times in the afternoon, and I keep a log of them because it is important that we stay up to date with what is happening. And right now, and I mean this with all the love and respect in the world, there are a lot of people out there who are afraid. And so, our job is to not wait until there's this huge drama and we have to, calm everybody down. Our job is to wait and see, trace events. So when there is a drama, the people who've been watching, the people who have been monitoring things, they're not terribly surprised that something happened. Like we weren't surprised when Operation Epic Fury or Roaring Lion finally started, but we've been monitoring things. But a lot of people, of course, were afraid and they were shocked. And we're here to not wait until there's a big drama and everyone is, wetting their pants, as it were. We're here to help maintain stability, keep everyone calm, because those of us who are calm and those of us who have been monitoring things, it's our job to go hold somebody's hand, put our arm around them, give them a shoulder to cry on, calm them down, right? Offer solace. And yes, there are people in Messianic congregations and synagogues right now who are staying up to date with the news. Not that you have to have a news roundup like we do at every Shabbat service. Others are going to wait until there is a major incident. That's wrong. That is irresponsible. But right now we're in a time when we can, guess what? We can change our ways and we can do our best to stay up to speed with everything. Okay, now before I get into this, somebody made a comment, an observation. I normally don't post the comments because your name and your picture will appear, but it had to do with the counting of the Omer. Normally, the difference between the traditional Pharisaic method, which is used in the synagogue, and the alternative Sadduceical method is only a few days. And I agree with you that when the Lord returns, when Yeshua returns, he's going to sort it all out. And actually, not to get into this too much, because we're going to have a couple of sessions probably later in the next few weeks, internally for our ministry, for our own family, for a number of years. We have not totally agreed on this. My stepfather, Mark Huey, has been a strong supporter of the alternative Sadduceical model. I, on the other hand, believe that the evidence supports, whether it's biblical as well as extra biblical, supports the traditional Pharisaical model. But actually what it comes down to is hermeneutics or interpretation and how little or how much information you're looking at. But that starts with looking at the counting of the Omer as specified in Leviticus, as well as how it is specified in Deuteronomy. And then from there, seeing how an ancient witness like the Greek Septuagint would translate what is admittedly ambiguous in the Hebrew, and whether a term like Shabbat, which we often always associate with the weekly Sabbath, whether the term Shabbat can also mean something else, like a period of 7 days, a week. So those are just a few things which all of us have to sort through, and nobody is going to break fellowship over the difference of one person's method being a couple of days different. So just wanted to address that. And as I said, go to messianicapologetics.net, go to the FAQ section, and we have a FAQ on counting the Omer. Both positions are represented. Okay, back to the news. So all of the news, all the stories I'm about to go through, these will be listed for you to look at. You can read the articles, watch the different clips, etc. when this episode is archived later today at messianicapologetics.net. Excuse me. Number one, we need to be praying for peace, Israel, Gaza, the Middle East, Iran. Pray for the believers, the Messianic Jewish community, the underground Christians in Iran. Pray for all the civilians. Pray that this Operation Epic Fury, Roaring Lion, is decisive, it's quick, and it's over as quickly as possible. Number two, be praying for peace, Russia, Ukraine. We really don't have much, in fact, anything on that today. And number three, reason and sanity to prevail here in the United States, the Western Hemisphere. We do have a number of stories involving Cuba. So things are just going to be rather interesting as we continue to wait, we continue to see. Okay, our first story, and this is from yesterday, the 16th of March, from Reverend Jordan Wells, who is a strong supporter of Israel, the Jewish people. I have to order his book about supporting Israel, and it goes into why replacement theology is wrong. But here, repost a clip from Mark Levin, 22 seconds. This is something very important for you to watch. Mark Levin drops a bombshell. Rejecting Judaism means you're not a true Christian and you're rejecting America itself. So I do recommend you watch this. But part of having, of course, a Judeo-Christian, or as I will frequently call it, a Judeo-Protestant heritage, is that it ultimately comes back to recognizing that Judaism and Christianity, yes, they have their differences, but they also have a lot in common. It goes back to what? It goes back to the Tanakh, the Old Testament, that ethical system, that value system. They may have interpreted different things different ways. They may have different approaches to various instructions, as we saw with our composition of Leviticus. But if you reject Judaism, you reject the Jewish people, you reject the Holy Scriptures of the Jewish people, the Tanakh, the Old Testament. And if you don't have an Old Testament, you have no New Testament, because that was the Bible of Jesus. That was the Bible of his first followers. And by extension, and I've seen this emphasized by Prime Minister Netanyahu, I saw it during various posts which were made during Hanukkah this past year. We as the Messianic community, without the Maccabean revolt, without the rededication of the temple and Hanukkah, you would have no temple in order for Yeshua of Nazareth to later come on the scene and, of course, be dedicated in, perform the various instructions required by the Torah. You needed a temple, you needed a Jewish people in order for Yeshua to come on the scene and be sacrificed as the Lamb of God. But Netanyahu had a much different approach, but you can't disagree with it. Without the Maccabees, without their rededication of the temple, you have no Holy Scriptures, you have no Western civilization, and guess what? You have without Western civilization, no United States of America. I can't disagree with that. But as we evaluate some of the positions, some of the opinions which are coming out of Christian nationalism now, which are attempting to blot out, to erase the legitimate Jewish contributions to American society, to the American Revolution, going back to the colonial period, you're going to see more and more, well, how dare you, claim that without Judaism, you have no Christianity, without Judaism, you have no America. And this is going to affect the Messianic community. Fortunately, there are people out there who are pushing back, and we're trying to do our part here on Messianic Insider. Okay, yesterday, the 16th of March, from Visegrad 24, 4:26 p.m., there's a 24-second clip. Trump on Cuba. I believe I'll have the honor of taking Cuba. That would be good. That's a big honor. I can free it or take it. I think I can do anything I want with it. Now, ever since the fall of the Maduro regime in Venezuela, of course, Venezuela was giving Cuba, most of their energy supply. It was also helping Cuba economically. Cuba has now been on, rationed energy. There've been a lot of blackouts. There are things are changing in Cuba right now. And of course, I know, as I'm sure many of you all do as well, there's a huge expatriate community, Cuban expatriate community in the United States, particularly in South Florida. When I lived in Central Florida, we had more Puerto Ricans in terms of Latinos, but we definitely had people from Cuba. In fact, in my old congregation, his wife had left Cuba after the revolution and was just really, just saddened at that about what Castro had done and everything else. So wanting to see the Cuban regime removed and see a more U.S. friendly regime restored, we're beginning to see that happen. Of course, the Castros, they're gone now. And how much of this change is coming because there was kind of a demagoguery associated with Fidel Castro and his brother Raul. Okay, I do want to clarify that Raul Castro, even though this is from Wikipedia, he is 94 years old. He has not died yet, but he's not in the political apparatus he's not active politically. So I just want to clarify that. Wikipedia is good to check, little things on the fly like that. But yeah. Oh, likewise, I've definitely talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis to my parents. What was that like? Talked about it with my grandparents when they were still alive. My grandfather had been at Guantanamo during the Second World War for a very brief moment to do some training. So we'll see what happens in Cuba in the coming weeks. But this is definitely a focus of the administration, definitely a focus of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, whose parents left Cuba. All right, next story, the 16th of March from Tusi TV. This follows up what we closed yesterday with. There's a 2-minute, 34-second clip, 1:07 p.m. So this was posted while we were live yesterday. Reports citing U.S. intelligence claim the Islamic Republic's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, may be gay, according to sources briefed to President Trump. So Tusi adds to this, the allegation has circulated quietly inside Iranian political circles for years, and we're just going to leave it at that. Of course, the big question I know a lot of people have is, Islam is so opposed to homosexuality. I guess they just look the other way with what a lot of their leaders might do. I mean, that's, of course, that has happened for centuries. Officially, the established religion says this, but then the leaders are able to get away with other things, which the normal people would not be able to get away with. But I know there are going to be a lot more stories about this sort of thing. All right, here was a post which came across my Instagram feed, which I thought was important to pass on to you. All right, and this is from the Instagram channel Stories of Anti-Semitism. Now, I'm not sure what denomination that minister is associated with, but I do not believe he's Roman Catholic. But I recommend you watch this. Here it talks about how if your church isn't talking about modern issues like anti-Semitism and the Middle East conflict at church, then how do you know if you're viewing them through a biblical lens? So this is from a Father Walker. And Father Walker talked about, if you will watch this, he talked about October the 7th, 2023, when you went to church that Sunday. Were they talking about what had just taken place in Israel with the Palestinian issue? And was this even mentioned at your church? Was it not mentioned at your church? By extension, was this mentioned at your Messianic congregation or synagogue, or did they just kind of like pass over it because don't want to get the people too stirred up? So here, the basic challenge issued is how, many people who go to church, they, and we're going to assume conservative, relatively evangelical, they have a biblical worldview on many issues, But when it comes to contemporary matters, events out in the world, different political matters, you got some people who go this way, and you got other people who go that way. And it's not good for those in leadership to just not have to deal with it. By extension, I know, and I've experienced this in the past, and I even remember the story of someone who was Messianic Jewish believer, raised in the Messianic Jewish synagogue, but in the Messianic Jewish synagogue, it was all about, especially for young Messianic Jews going through bar, bat mitzvah. It was all about, your Jewish heritage, being Jewish, Jewish culture, Jewish tradition, etc. And yes, those are very important things. And that's one of the main reasons why we've got a Messianic Jewish movement. But almost no instruction about human sexuality and in, marital relations and all of this. If it had not been for that person also attending Christian school, that person never would have really had any instruction on the birds and the bees, because it really wasn't talked about at the Messianic congregation. And of course, our responsibility as God's people is to make sure all of these things, all the important matters get talked about. But in terms of an issue like human sexuality, when I went through in 1993, this was, of course, 33 years ago now, United Methodist Confirmation. We got some, really good sexual instruction from Pastor Bill Hughes. We did. And it pertained to how many of us were teenagers, we're 12, 13, 14 years old. Our bodies are changing. We're about to be recognized as members of the church. And in that process, not only did we learn how to be a good Christian, read our Bibles, hear different programs for outreach and service in the local church and in our denomination, but we had discussions about human sexuality. I hope in your Messianic congregations, bar or bat mitzvah program, they have discussions about human sexuality. Because you can't always assume, well, they're getting it at home from their parents. Parents frequently assume they're getting it at church or in their religious place. And the religious place, they don't do it. And then what happens is somebody else steps in. The school steps in. Their friends step in. Now we've got the internet, which steps in. So this thing about avoiding contemporary issues, it has a reverberating effect, and it involves, okay, yeah, there are controversial matters out there, but if you're in leadership, if you're in a position of influence, you have a responsibility to talk about these things and to talk about them fairly. I mean, we're not going to have diagrams of human anatomy when you talk about some of this, but at the same time, you do need to be able to have those mature adult conversations if necessary. So that was a good post, and I recommend you all look at it. Okay, from 2C TV, and this is yesterday, 7:15 p.m., 2 minutes, 11 seconds. He talks about mounting pressure on the Islamic Republic. Reports suggest missile stockpiles or launch capability are dwindling as interceptions continue. Footage shows IDF soldiers cheering, incoming threats being neutralized, while IRGC spokesman issues fresh threats against President Trump. Yes, the current operation, one of the main goals of it is to neutralize the Islamic Republic's ability to launch ballistic missiles, and their supply is steadily dwindling. Okay, our next story from Open Source Intel Defender yesterday at 6:08 p.m. As U.S. and Cuban officials negotiate over the future of the communist rule and economically besieged Caribbean island nation, excuse me, the Trump administration is seeking to push President Miguel Diaz-Canel from power in Havana. In a move that's similar to recent actions in Venezuela, would topple a key figurehead, but leave in place the communist repressive government that has ruled Cuba since 1959. Okay, we just don't know how a regime change in Cuba would actually work out. But you look at some of the other commentary out there, and some of the reforms that might be announced or in the process of being announced or have been announced regarding businesses in Cuba, many of those reforms reflect what was taking place in 1990, 1991 with perestroika in the former Soviet Union. I mean, I remember when I was in third and fourth grade, we got our weekly reader, right? Some of you all remember those. And we heard about how the Soviet Union is modernizing, it's liberalizing a little bit, controls are lessening up. And of course, one of the big things was the opening of the McDonald's and later Pizza Hut in the Soviet Union. And with that, very quickly, the Soviet Union began to unravel, so that by the end of 1991, many of us remember it was Christmas Day. The hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin, and then the tricolor of old Russia was raised in its place. Could something like that play out in Cuba? We will wait and see. But many are comparing the negotiations to what took place in the former Soviet Union. Excuse me. So, with that in mind, passed on by Gunther Eagleman, 23-second clip from Fox News. Just in, total blackout across all of Cuba. The entire island has virtually zero electricity as the U.S. oil and energy blockade tightens. Power plants dead, streets dark, regime in panic. So, of course, we will wait and see what transpires in Cuba. Now, does this have any specific effect on the end time scenario? Not as much as it has an effect on the Western Hemisphere, knowing that Cuba has been a problem for decades, going back, in my case, to my parents' childhood. And it's many of us know people from Cuba or have connections to Cuba. They fled the communist regime, and many of them want to return home and they want to rebuild their country to what was lost. Okay, here's another one on Cuba, passed on from Representative Carlos A. Jimenez from Florida. He's a Republican. 20-second clip here on Cuba will be free. The countdown to a free Cuba has begun, with President Trump and Marco Rubio leading the way. Liberty is only weeks away. No more regime, no more oppression. So he's definitely someone who wants to see the communist regime gone. Okay, we've got 8 more stories, and I'll try to go a little more quickly. Here is something from Newsmax on Instagram. I recommend you watch it, from Greg Kelly Reports. In his estimations, a few minutes long, I think we kind of just won the war. So he talks about the Strait of Hormuz here. And of course, the Strait of Hormuz, you've all seen it by now on many different news broadcasts. That is where around 1/5 of the world's oil and gas supply has to transverse. And the Iranian Islamic Republic has announced that only at this point, United States and Israeli vessels cannot transverse the Strait of Hormuz. Everyone else can. Now, in Greg Kelly's estimation, well, that's a huge victory, because guess what? The United States doesn't tend to send tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. Those which are bound for the United States are flagged from countries like Panama or Barbados or some other country. So simply because it's going to the U.S. market doesn't mean that it has to be a U.S. flagged ship. Israel, they get their oil from the Mediterranean. They get their oil from Azerbaijan, so it doesn't affect Israel either. So in his mind, because the strait's open to all shipping except U.S. and Israeli, the U.S. doesn't use it. So he takes this as a victory. Of course, this is a situation which changes day to day. I fully expect when this conflict is over, all shipping will be able to go through the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, as you see what will likely be the rebuilding when this conflict is over, the rebuilding will, in all likelihood, involve, do we need to put some kind of a canal as a secondary artery to, running parallel to the Strait of Hormuz? You've all seen that, an artery through the UAE and part of Oman. We'll wait and see. But I believe that when this Iranian crisis is over, you're going to see a lot of attention, a lot of investment put into the Middle East, not only rebuilding, but making it more modern and more efficient. And hey, it does say in the scriptures that we're going to go into a period of peace and safety, or peace and security, and economic safety, economic security has got to be tied into that. All right, here's an important comment from Open Source Intel, posted last night, 9:24 p.m. Former IDF General Avivi says a turning point is near, with Iranians expected to be urged into the streets under the cover of aerial support. An open source's observation is, wow. So, of course, we don't know what's going to happen, but that is something, of course, important to keep in mind. Okay, so our next story, and this is something we all encountered in the middle of the night, and it is a huge development in Operation Epic Fury Roaring Lion. This is the first one I saw, Visegrad 24, which was from more or less a news source, not people commenting on it. From 4:46 a.m., March the 17th, top Iranian politician Ali Larijani, who played an important role after the death of Ayatollah Khamenei, and that's just a little over 2 weeks ago, and had vowed to teach the USAA lesson, has been killed in a strike. Iran's top security chief has been eliminated. And indeed, this is a huge development, is a huge crippling blow to the Islamic Republic. So here's another post on it from 2CTV, 5:52 a.m., March the 17th. Breaking: Islamic Republic's de facto leader, Ali Larijani, has been eliminated. We're reaching the final days of the Islamic occupation in Iran. That is his observation. So we know this conflict is just a little over 2 weeks old now, 2.5 weeks old. And we are, of course, waiting to see what's going to transpire. All right, 4 more stories, and then we will conclude. From Instagram, the Epoch Times, the headline: most NATO members won't join U.S.-Israel war against Iran, Trump says. The president said U.S. forces have had great success against Iran despite receiving little to no assistance from the NATO alliance. Now, I did see a number of other clips from the president. He was at the Oval Office with the Taoiseach, or Prime Minister of Ireland, because today is St. Patrick's Day, and by tradition, the Taoiseach of Ireland will come to the U.S., come to the White House, visit with the president. So they're all wearing green. And there was a lot of discussion about the U.S. and NATO and what NATO is doing or what NATO is not doing. And as a consequence of Operation Epic Fury, will the U.S. relationship with NATO be altered? We know the president's been very tough on NATO, talking about how the U.S. pulls everyone else's weight. Other NATO members, the European countries, they need to contribute more to NATO in terms of economics, in terms of military hardware, etc. We don't know yet, but of course, that's when a lot of people begin to ask, is NATO just a relic of the Cold War period? Is it even relevant anymore? We wait and see what's going to happen. Okay, here, some of the political fallout of the operation in Iran. This is from Breitbart. That is Joe Kent. Trump's political opposition celebrates Joe Kent resignation over Iran war. So some of you all may have seen his resignation. President Donald Trump's opposition in the media and political class are celebrating Joe Kent's resignation as the director of National Counterterrorism Center over the war in Iran. Now, whenever there is a major conflict which takes place, not a surprise that some members of the administration, some members of the government say, I cannot in all good conscience continue in this, and they resign. That's happened in the modern period many, many times. But this is the reason he gave, and this is what we have to pay attention to. Kent announced his resignation in a post on X on Tuesday morning, saying he cannot in good conscience support the ongoing war in Iran, and claiming that pressure from Israel started the war. So you're going to see a number of people who note that Joe Kent resigned from his position because he thought that this is Israel's war, America's having to fight it, and the Israel lobby is ultimately responsible. That affects us as Messianic people. Uh, there are plenty of people who recognize that Operation Epic Fury is in the United States' interests, going back to the 1979 revolution and what happened during the Carter years. Yes, Israel has got similar interests as well, but there are going to be plenty, oh, we're fighting Israel's war and all that. And we take note of this because it kind of tells the temperature, barometric pressure in both society as well as in the spirit regarding the end time scenario. So we'll see what happens. See if anybody else resigns or anyone else issues any kind of statements regarding the U.S. is fighting Israel's war. I believe the U.S. has its own interests in this conflict, which complement Israel's interests, but the U.S. is also interested in various geopolitical elements, China, Russia, etc. Okay, from the Telegraph on Instagram. This is from earlier today. Iran's security chief's death is more significant than that of supreme leader. That was kind of interesting. Just before Iran's supreme leader was killed in an airstrike on the opening day of the war, that's Ayatollah Khamenei, and an Iranian official dropped a clue as to who really held the power behind the scenes. So it was this fellow, apparently. So now with him gone, what direction is Operation Epic Fury, Roaring Lion going to take? Okay, we wait and see. And we continue to pray as believers for the safety of all civilians, especially the underground Christian community in Iran, the Messianic Jewish community in Israel. And we pray for a quick, decisive end to this conflict. Okay, and our final story, and this is something which circulates on social media just about every time this year, St. Patrick's Day. This is from One for Israel Ministries. Thought I'd pass it along. The headline: St. Patrick was a Messianic Jew? Question mark, exclamation mark. So, according to them, there is evidence that St. Patrick was Jewish. In fact, there's a lot about that guy you might not know. The truth has been hidden behind copious amounts of beer, leprechauns, and rivers dyed green in his honor. But all of this would be utterly foreign to this hero of faith from the 5th century. So you all can read this. You all can look into it. I know some of it is involved with a number of the practices of the Celtic Church, which were different than the Roman Church. There are mixed reports that early on the Celtic Church was Sabbatarian and they observed forms of the festivals of Israel and what have you. I find it interesting speculation. This is to be differentiated from British Israel claims, of course, that lost Israelites from the Northern Kingdom went up to the British Isles. And, one of the symbols of Ireland is, of course, the harp. Okay, that's great. Certainly harkens back to the Middle Ages, but some claim, well, that's really representative of the harp of David, which made its way, all that kind of mythology. I'm far more inclined to be open-minded that, well, maybe St. Patrick had Jewish heritage. There's no way of knowing it for 100% sure. But our attention today, and I saw the speech, I saw clips from the speech issued by the President of Ireland, Catherine Connolly, about Patrick. Everybody went after her. She didn't say it was St. Patrick. So that's an attack on Christianity, Christian faith. We look at Ireland today. We look at the British Isles today. We've come a long way in the past 3 to 5 centuries for certain, and definitely going back to the time of Patrick. Now, I am mainly, as a McKee, of Scots Ulster extraction. The McKees originally were from, of course, Scotland, west of what is today Glasgow. And for a generation or two, they did settle in Ulster, Northern Ireland, Belfast. And then two of them came over to the American colonies in 1767 and eventually made their way to Western Pennsylvania. And yes, they were Presbyterian. And so for many years, not only on my McKee side, but also my Jeffrey side, which had Scottish ancestry as well, we never wore green on St. Patrick's Day. We always wore orange, which is what Protestants traditionally have done. But today, we're living in a much different world because of secularization, Islamification. It's something which those in the British Isles have to deal with in a much more concentrated way than we do in America. Of course, in America, St. Patrick's Day is more about green beer, leprechauns, getting drunk. It's not about the religious heritage of a St. Patrick who, according to this post at least, may have been a Messianic Jew. But I think it's speculation, but I did think it was useful to pass it along. We've come a very long way. Even the original Republic of Ireland, after its independence from Great Britain, it had yes, Catholicism had a significant role in the government, but it had a fairly decent constitution. There were Protestants in the Republic of Ireland as well. But for example, originally enshrined in its constitution, abortion was illegal, with the exception of, various, medical emergencies. That is something which, of course, in the past few years got changed. Abortion is now legal in the Republic of Ireland. Originally, it was, to save the life of a mother or some extreme, circumstance that didn't prohibit people from going to the UK or the Netherlands or someplace else to have an abortion. Women could do that. But, to me, when I think about St. Patrick's Day, I think back Ireland, the British Isles, how it used to be a strong vestige of Christianity. Yes, from my family's heritage, Protestantism. Now, not so much. And that really is kind of heartbreaking for me. So, all right, that concludes our news roundup, and we will see how some of these stories develop by tomorrow and throughout the rest of the week. Now, tomorrow, because this survey of Leviticus study was just kind of a one-off study, we're going to start a multi-part series going through my article, which I originally wrote back in 2008. It's gone through a few revisions, addressing the frequently avoided issues Messianics encounter in the Torah. So I've talked about, particularly going back to the One Law, One Torah theology series we had a number of weeks ago, talked about how a major weakness for many Messianics is reading the Torah, not just the Bible, but reading specifically the 5 books of Moses from some kind of ancient Israelite perspective first. Torah is not timeless. The ancient Israelites were the original recipients. And the simple yet complicated rule of Bible interpretation: interpret a text for its original audience first, deduce principles for today. So when we read the Torah, we have to first, what did it mean to ancient Israel? And then what do we see elucidated upon in further salvation history? The prophets, the apostolic scriptures, and most especially, how are certain things affected by the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord. So I don't know how many parts that series is going to be, but it could take, ballpark around 2 weeks or so. And I'm also going to be penciling in the discussion on counting the Omer as we approach Passover and unleavened bread. As always, on behalf of Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support for all of our ministry efforts. Please do consider signing up for a monthly $25 or $50 donation. Be sure to visit my website, messianicapologetics.net, where you can access a wide array of articles, frequently asked questions entries, back issues of our newsletter, Outreach is Real News, back episodes of Messianic Insider, different McKee moment shorts, etc. Be sure to give this episode a thumbs up or a heart, as it will definitely help its exposure on social media. And please do repost this to your social media feeds, Facebook, Instagram, X, email it to a friend. We will see you again tomorrow with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you, shalom, and take care.